All right, guys, welcome to the first lecture. Today we are looking at lines and art. And so we're going to be kind of talking about what are lines, what's the purpose, look at a couple different types, both in different ways that you can produce them, as well as look at a few artworks and how they're used. So first, I'm going to kind of be going back and forth between the PowerPoint and lecture notes. So just expect it to kind of, like I said, we'll be going back and forth. So what are lines, right? If we look at that first and say, well, not just what are lines, but also, I guess, the importance of line, right? And so we start with the importance, and then we'll look at the types of lines. Lines can cause different reactions based on the variations used. So depending on how lines are done by the artist is going to create different reactions by the viewer. And this can also, the reactions don't always have to be the same. So one person that is viewing the artwork may have a sensation or feeling of a line that another may not. And cultural aspects do sometimes come into play. But for the most part, what we're going to look at here are kind of the general things that lines tend to do for most people. So they can be active or static, right? So what does that mean? Active, where it looks like it's got movement to it. Static, meaning that it's stationary or one place. They can come off as aggressive or passive, right? So it can lines can produce a sense of emotion and feeling and almost kind of thought in some of the ways. We don't think of it that way. Lines are in everything around us in life, and then reflected in art, and the way that lines are used tends to be connected to how we see lines in life, and sometimes it's an illusion reflecting that idea, and we'll look at an example of that with directional line, where it's an illusion creating a sense of height and it being really large, but it's still what we would see if we were looking at those use of lines in real life. Okay, so aggressive or passive, they can come off as sensual or mechanic. So it can have a lot of emotion in a line, which is often something we don't think about, that lines have emotion, or that they can at least portray it. Lines don't have emotion in of itself, but the artist is putting in the emotion in creating the line, and that is often reflected in certain types of lines, versus mechanical, where you're looking at things that seem very orderly and precise and organized. These are often seen as in shapes as geometric shapes, well, or the lines are usually comprised, mechanical lines, to form geometric shapes, whereas sensual or emotional lines tend to be more irregular. So we're going to talk about irregular and regular lines in just a minute. It can also imply volume, so that what you're drawing looks like it has volume to it, or it can imply solid mass. So it can look like it's a solid object. It also can suggest motion. As well as emotion, right? And that kind of goes with the active or static as well. It can also create a sense of light or shadow. And it can also create textures and patterns. So lines can do a lot. And, why important because it does all these things, right? The importance of a line, it is in everything. I mean, that alone makes it important. You can't have art without lines. It's impossible to do. So that's certainly part of it right there, is that just the fact that lines are in every aspect of life, every aspect of art. You can't avoid them. But it's also important because of how much the purpose of lines, how much it creates all of these different, often opposing ideas, feelings, perceptions, all come from line. So I think that's important. You know, we tend to think of line as, we'll do here types of line, as tend to be kind of boring. Like, oh, you know, a line is a line, you know, so what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is just how much it can play into how we perceive something. And again, whether that's in art or in real life. Now, math, if we look at like the math definition of art, which is not what we're going to focus on for the most part, but I think it's an important place to start, because you have a mathematical definition of a line, not of art, sorry, of a line. And then you have the types of lines and kind of the definitions for each of these in terms of art. And it is different. The definition of line in math is definitely much more the mechanical, regular line. Mathematical definition doesn't account for all these other differences, and it doesn't have the emotion because it's being used to define mathematical terms. So in the math definition, it's a line is straight and one-dimensional. So there's no kind of any kind of perceived depth or dimension outside of the singular dimension of it. So one-dimensional. It is a figure that has no thickness. It is also it extends indefinitely. Right, so that's important in that a line in math never ends, and in both directions. So how you would portray a line if you were doing it in math would be, well, one way is you have the arrows, because it represents, the arrows mean that it continues on, you know, indefinitely. You can also have a line segment, which is with the dots. So this is a line. This is a line segment. And then you have a ray, which has an endpoint but goes off indefinitely in one direction. Okay, so the thing with this is that it works when, you know, you're using it for math, but the definition of a line in math is very limiting, because there's so much more that goes in when you use lines for art rather than just in math. But I think it is important. We're talking about what's the purpose of a line. It's not just art, right? It's a line is in math. A line is in everything in life. But this is kind of a good starting point of the most basic, straightforward definition in mathematical terms is this. And a lot of times when you talk about lines, and like I said, okay, we're going to learn about lines in art, this is what people think about. Not all the stuff we're going to look about. They simply think about the most simplistic definition and term of a line, usually connected, even if they're not recognizing in their head that it's connected to math, they're connecting it to one of these type of thing. And then, or of course, you know, the more basic, just a line without the arrows, but the arrows are simply used in the mathematical terms to imply that it technically continues on forever. Okay, so that's the mathematical definition. Let's look at what are the different types of lines in art, because there's obviously more than just these in terms of math. So you have regular, yeah, we're on there, regular and irregular lines. And we're going to look at those first in just a minute. Okay, you also have, yeah, we're on the right numbering system here. After regular and irregular, you have contour lines. And there's several different types of contour lines. If we want to get specific here, you have blind contour. You also can have continuous. Then we have implied lines, and directional, and then communicative. So what we're going to do in this lecture is look at these types of lines. Okay, so we addressed the math line, we just kind of like why lines, but now we're going to look at each one of these types of lines. So the first we're going to do is irregular, regular and irregular, not irregular first. Regular and irregular lines. Now in art, artists usually use both types. It's rare that you only have an artist use just regular lines or irregular. They often are blended and mixed together. And that's kind of done for a purpose because each one tends to represent different types of things. So for a regular line, right, a regular line in its most simplistic form is that. But that's not the only type of regular line that can take place. You can also have, vertical lines. You can have somewhat of a zigzag pattern. You can have a curved line. You can have a spiral line. Right? So there's some regular types of lines. What defines a regular line, though? It tends to be something that is carefully measured. So it comes off with a sense of control and planning, right? If you look at all of these, there's kind of a purpose to them. They're organized. It's not something that was sporadically drawn, right? They all have a kind of a purpose, often in communicating or providing direction. So this is important too. What we're talking about with regular and irregular lines goes into those other type of lines that we're talking about. Directional, communicative, contour lines. Those types play into everything else. But this is what you tend to see more if you think of like architecture. That is a great example of regular lines. It comes off in a sense of planning and organized, right? So that's a sense that regular lines give. And they are super effective for communicating ideas. And often with a connection to objectivity. So we'll say with objectivity. But that's it just comes off, and when we look at regular lines, they look more ordered, right? Carefully measured. Let's put ordered here. There seems to be an order and purpose. Planning and organized, we could go / purpose, right? With that, I think that covers it there. But it appears, even if it isn't, right? It appears and puts off a sense of purpose and organization that irregular lines do not. So for irregular lines, then, what makes up that? So for the example first, these are Those are irregular lines, right? Anything that is like that. So what's the difference, right, between this, if we go back up for a second, or here, we'll go with the zigzag here. What's the difference between the zigzag and this? Well, one is that this still comes off in this kind of measured sense, and it doesn't always have to be. I kind of made those even. You know, you could have one that is more different heights. But if you start getting too involved with different heights, then it can shift from regular to irregular. But here you have a flow, but then it kind of goes off in a completely different direction, right? So you have that sense of, again, it's really a sense that it provides of regular, of order versus chaos. And that's one of the, here, we'll put 2 here. Irregular lines seem to provide a sense of chaos and disorder. They can seem wild. This tends to be more reflected in nature or organic. Right, we're going to look at organic shapes next time. And organic shapes have a sense of irregular lines. And the reason for this, nature and organic. Why nature and organic? Oh, that's one we could add to this too. You know, man-made. Okay, because regular lines come off more as man-made because they are lines that you don't always see in nature. You see them in architecture. You see them in things that humans, it's with man-made, but it's humans, not just men. Humans have created. And whereas irregular lines, and I mean, you get too chaotic with irregular lines and it's going to come off as human-made as well. But if you're going around in, you know, these odd shapes, the reality is if you look at with nature and organic, like a rock, a tree, bugs, whatever, right? That those things aren't straight and ordered and unified and symmetrical. It's why when if you have a tree, and when kids are learning to draw trees, they tend to do this, right? And this isn't as realistic as when you have, well, there's different ways you could do trees as far as, if you're looking at branches, for example, if someone's drawing a branch, they're gonna make bumps going in and around because even branches aren't straight, right? If you do a branch where you just go like this, right? And so I'm doing the same type of branch here, but I'm just making regular lines, right? You have regular versus irregular. The one that's going to come off a more realistic and a larger picture is going to be the irregular because it comes off as more organic, right? Where this does not look organic. The other way you can see it is if you have a row of trees and they're all the same height, right? Or the mountains and the mountain range where the peaks are all the same. That's not how nature works. That's not how organic things work. They're irregular. They're not these organized, perfectly aligned lines and shapes. So we tend to think of irregular as connected to nature. But it also can, like I said, if you're looking more at chaos and disorder, right? than these other types of lines, or especially this we'll look at in just a minute, is called, this is often seen as scribble art. If it's done, well, it's called scribbling, right? But can be transformed into scribble art. And even the word scribble, scribble is meant to imply that there's no kind of order to it. You're just running the pen around. And scribble art's going to have an order to it, in that you're using the irregular lines and to scribbles to create a picture or an image, or at least implied image. It's just a straight scribble, just, is something that you just do, and it's completely random. There's not a sense of purpose or order to it, right? So that's why those tend to give you the feeling of chaos and disorder. And then other irregular lines tend to give you a sense of nature and organic, because those things like rocks and trees and bugs aren't perfectly symmetrical, perfectly ordered. These also tend to be, because it's connected to nature as well, free and unrestrained. The irregular lines are more likely to be used by artists. We'll say more often used to express emotion and feeling, because they give a sense of that, right? If you have these kind of flowing movement lines versus straight calculated lines, the ones that are more like this are going to come off as having a sense of, this is how you create, like someone that's having clearly not in a good mental headspace with scribbles all over the place, right? That's going to seem like the angst or anxiety. So I think that's important too, as you look at, is that lines, like I said, they aren't these kind of boring things that are in a vacuum that don't have connections. It's amazing how much different types of lines showcase different emotional states and feelings, and how we take that in when we look at them. So let's look at a couple pictures here. The first one, regular lines. So right, one of the things that this tends to connect to is the sense of more geometric shape. Again, these look mechanical. This is the use of regular lines. It also has shapes in it, by the way. The regular lines connect to make shapes, which will be what we're looking at in our next lecture. Here you have a spiral, or a type of spiral, but regular lines can be curved. So we have curved lines here that then are connected by other straight lines, regular lines, right? That create a sense of illusion. Regular lines are fantastic for illusions. If you love doing any type of illusion art, there's some really cool illusion art that you can do with regular lines. They're the best for that. And I mean, here is an example of that, right? But these all look like they're very planned out, right? Someone had to, it has that sense of architectural quality to it. They're straight, they're ordered. It even like these extending lines here, right, create a sense of making it look like it's architecture. It doesn't look like this was done haphazardly or quickly. It creates a sense of order and organization. Then if you look at irregular lines, right, here's scribble art. Here's just a bunch of different types of scribbles that are all examples of that. What's interesting with this is, right, we've taken these irregular lines in scribble art, which is meant to be the sense of randomness, and you can find these examples of scribble types, so that if you're trying to use it for scribble art to create a certain look, they're giving you ideas of what you can do. So in that sense, that's that human-made, man-made kind of thing, is that even that we're trying to create order out of chaos by saying, okay, which type of chaotic scribble do I want to use? Now, how is it seen in art? Because these still look like doodles, right? This is often what we would call doodling, rather than in art yet. But what you can do is it can take scribble art. here's an example of using irregular lines and what is traditionally seen as scribble art to make what looks like a panda out of a bunch of irregular lines. So that it has, but this is where the scribble art and the irregular lines also creates a sense of chaos or emotion, right? That looks like this is not a happy bear. And part of what gives that sense versus like one that's yawning or something is the chaotic nature. The irregular lines naturally showcase movement as well. So it's not just chaos, right? It looks like it's in constant movement. And that's based on that erratic nature of irregular lines. Discard. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is contour lines. Contour lines, and contour in French means outline. Oh, there we go. I was going to say, if it froze up, I might have to pause for a second here. Sometimes it does that. I think I have too many things running in the background. Okay, so we're on 3 here. Contour lines, right? So the word itself in French means outline, and that's what contour lines are, is drawing the outline of something, and it doesn't have to be complete. You can have incomplete contour lines, and that's a style of art, incomplete contour line art, so that you showcase just part of it. It can also sometimes be connected over to implied, that we'll look at in a minute, but it's specifically an edge or profile besides outline, right? That your focus of the lines, what you're focusing on in contour lines in art is the shape of the person or object, right? And this is inevitably the goal, right? Is you're not focused on shading or tone, not shape, shading or tone. All right, there we go. Shading or tone. Instead, you're focused on the edge or profile, the shape of it. Now, contour lines can express volume and space. So let's see what they can express. It's not just an outline. It starts as an outline, and you are drawing the outline of something. But in doing so, you can use it to express, like I said, volume in space. So how much volume something has. It can provide communicative shape, or it can communicate, well, we'll just say communicate shape. Okay. Shape, right? Because with an outline you tend to be drawing that. It also, you can show some depth. And so that's the various aspects of what contour lines can do. Blind contour is a style where you only look, oops, that should have been, those are the ones that have been numbers too, only look at the object you're drawing. So you do not take your eyes off of whatever it is you're looking. Let's say we're going to look at an example of an apple. So let's say you placed an apple on the table, and then you have your piece of paper and a pen in front of you. You don't ever look down at the paper. You keep your entire focus on the object. And the purpose of that is it's meant to create better hand-eye coordination and focus. It also, so here we'll put that, hand-eye coordination. It's actually a really good, it seems weird, and when you're doing it. But part of the idea is it's a practice tool for paying attention to the object that you are drawing, right? Because if you're looking back and forth between the paper, you're not focusing on just what you see, and really focusing in on what you're trying to outline. Your brain is making connections and adding things that aren't necessarily what you see. This focuses the mind to only produce what you see. This tends to go in with continuous contour, and continuous contour is when you don't pick your pencil up. So here you would look at usually blind contour is also continuous contour, so that you are drawing a line, you're drawing some type of artwork, and let's say it was an apple, right, where you don't ever stop, right, the drawing. So right, my line didn't break. If you were going to, I'm trying to think of something that would be I backtracked a little at the end there, right? But the idea is that I'm not looking, and you can do continuous and not do blind contour, okay? So let's put that, continuous does not have to be blind. Why usually blind contour is continuous is because if you're not looking at your paper and you pick your pencil up, good luck putting it right back down where you were. Usually that leads to 2 or 3 different places on the paper where you're drawing, because you even if you don't think you moved it, you did. But continuous contour does not have to be blind. I can only look at the paper like I was doing here, and not be looking at the object. So those two often go hand in hand, though. And again, it's this focus on just the outline of an object. It's also looking at how everything's connected, rather than separating out. Oh, so here we'll do like a sun, like a drawing of a sun. So if I go with a sun where I don't, right, it's still simplistic, but I didn't take, you kind of backtrack over parts, versus if you were doing it not continuous, you do the circle first, then I pick my pencil up, and then I might do the rays here, right? Versus where everything is ultimately attached, because it's all one continuous line. But again, here you can see with either of these, it's focused on the outline and the edge and the shape. Not so much. I'm not doing any shading. I'm not putting in, different tones or shades or color. I'm focused on that outline component. So why do this? All right, why contour lines? Well, one, as I mentioned, coordination is a good practice skill just for essentially training your hand in art. It's also just good for coordination outside of art in that sense. It creates a specific focus on the outline of objects, which are often not looked at. There's lots of stuff where you actually you're not actually drawing the outline at all. The outline becomes implied in that sense. It can also create a sense of simplicity or ease. So contour art often comes off as something that someone just casually did, right? That they were just going for a casual little drawing that they didn't put a lot of time or effort into, which is not true. But it's the sense that it gives. So if you're wanting your art to give that sense of simplicity and ease because it doesn't have all this micro detail and shading and perspective and various other elements in it, that's what contour lines can do. So let's take a look at that. Right here in a simple example, a music note, right? It's just the line, and this could be done in a continuous, right, contour line, or I mean, this one definitely is because you don't see a break. You could, if you're sketching it out, you could be drawing more in a sketch way, but then that's definitely not continuous anymore. You're sketching it out. Oops. And so I'm breaking from that. But these type of things are some of the easiest for continuous contour. Here's the example of the apple I was talking about, right? So here's your object, the apple, and here is the contour line. This is not continuous. Again, contour line does not have to be continuous. It doesn't have to be blind. Those are the other two types that it can be. So here they have the outline of the apple that you could draw, and then you stop and you break for the stem. And the focus and purpose here isn't to do it in one continuous motion, but instead to focus on just the outline, right? So you're not getting the veins, you're not getting the shading that's going on here with the different values, right? That's not the focus. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to provide an outline of that object. Here is an example from art by Henri Matisse, a woman. It's very literal naming of this artwork. Woman seated in armchair. It's like, what do we name this art? Oh, well, she's a woman and she's sitting in an armchair. There we go. Title. I always think it's funny when the titles are very like literal. I'm just going to give a description and there is my title. And so here we have contour lines. How do we have contour line in every aspect of focus of the outline, right? You don't have the detail of the wood grain in the chair. It's the outline of the chair. It's the outline of her arm, even of her dress. And even though you have the lines inside the dress to create some sense of depth, it's not, there's no shading going on, right? It's every aspect, whether it's the necklace, the bracelet, the hair, the face, right? It's all focused on the outline of the people and or objects. But so here, like I said, here's an example in art of how contour line can be used. And again, I think it shows you how it provides a sense of casual aspect in how you view it. And then, we're going to move to implied lines here. So let's discard. Let's go to that one. So our next type of line, as mentioned, was implied line. And implied lines are a combination of actual lines, which are often, they don't always have to be regular. So that and an actual line is just this. That's an actual line, right? That are seen as continuous marks, but are not. Implied lines are an illusion. So I'll give you an example of that. And there can be some really cool illusions with this. It's impressive what people can do with implied lines. The purpose of the illusion, right, is it gives an impression that we are seeing a line. But technically, what it is, it's a illusion. So I'll give you an example of that. And there can be some really cool illusions with this. It's impressive what people can do with implied lines. The purpose of the illusion, right, is it gives an impression that we are seeing a line. But technically, what it is, it's a illusion. So I'll give you an example of that. And there can be some really cool illusions with this. It's impressive what people can do with implied lines. But technically, it's not a continuous line, right? And sometimes it's not even a line, so that we're seeing a line that is continuous. Oops. We'll say, but doesn't have to be made up of lines. Implied lines can be made up of virtually anything. Okay, so let's look a couple examples, then I'll show you the PowerPoint there for that. The most simplistic basic implied line is this, right? And here we have a bunch of actual lines, but you have this part that's broken up in between, right? So that it's not one continuous actual line, right? Or this regular continuous line, right? Versus implied. That's at its most basic structure. However, I can make an implied line out of circles, out of a shape, right? So I put a bunch of circles in a line, and it doesn't have to be straight, right? I can make it curved, so I could go up and down with that, but that you have now an implied line, but it's made up of a shape of circles. You can also have implied lines, which we're going to look at with an example of the art in a minute, with words, so that you can have small words that say, you know, hello, what is your name, etc., etc. And it's really small, and I meant to make this small so you could almost not read it. So that then if you put it in the border of something, it ends up looking like a line, but when you zoom in closer, you realize that it's words. And this, like I said, anything you can possibly think of where you're breaking up something, but what it does is that it ultimately creates an illusion of a line. And there's much cooler ones than this. These are just the most basic ones. So let's take a look at some really nice examples. And here, keeping with the Apple theme for just a minute, right? Defined lines are contour lines. Right, you have, and now this art here of this apple has more than just contour lines. It also goes into shading and value, right, that you've got here with the different shading and value. But this line here is a defined line. It's clearly an actual defined line. Implied lines, if you look, there's no line. So what's making it look like there's a line? It's the shading, right, coloring and shading going right around that then creates this implied edge or line. Even more impressive in that are these examples of implied lines, right? So these are all broken up. This feather is all made up of implied lines, or this road, right? This curved, windy road, or it looks like a road to me. This is all implied. Because how it's made up is from what's fun with this one, right, is it's using regular actual lines to create an implied line. So they have vertical and horizontal lines that then create where I followed the implied line here, right? This is the implied line, is the negative space actually that these lines create ends up creating that implied line. So you can do a lot of cool illusion stuff with implied lines, and they're really fun to do because it says you can do with everything. This is from an illustrated manuscript from a Jewish religious text, and you have the normal writing in here, and this part here is what looks like implied line. But if you zoom into it, this is actually writing, right? So that's where I mentioned we'd see that example. All of this border stuff here and the picture, it's really small writing that then creates these images and lines that are implied lines. So again, the sky's the limit on what an artist can come up with implied lines. Next, we're going to look at directional line. And directional line and communicative line kind of go together in some of its purpose. Come on, stop freezing up on me here. Every so often, this happens. Okay, so we are on 5. Directional lines most often communicate direction and movement. They can also set boundaries. It can give depth. The purpose of directional line is in the word to direct our attention to a specific point. So the goal when an artist uses directional lines is to get you to look, because our eyes naturally look at certain things based on where we're guided. I mean, so the most obvious directional line is if you end up creating a shape with the directional line. It's not straight there, where you have an arrow, right? Because then it's directing you to that point. But if you have, often directional lines are bold and large because it plays into directing. It doesn't always have to be, but it's meant to have you go in that way. And why it creates movement is because the directional line is indicating a place to follow, to look. So an example of that, I have skipped one implied line. Here's another example of art. The Devil Made Me Do It. Sour Kids, which is a group of graphic artists. And they have a bunch of different types of implied lines, right? You've got implied lines here, implied lines there, implied lines there. They're kind of all throughout the artwork. Here is an example of a directional line. So the directional lines used here are these big pillars. And they're meant to, and in the background, you have the later faint buildings, which also are using a sense of directional line, but the most obvious in the forefront lines, and this is by, it's called The Connectors by James Allen. It's meant to create a sense of height and depth. So that when we look at this picture, we go, wow, they're really high up. But of course, it's on paper. It isn't, there is no actual depth to a drawing. It's all done by lines, shapes, shading, etc., all these elements we're learning about to create a sense of that. And so you can also see that, right, that they're bold and large because the goal is to get your eyes. This is what you notice first. When you look at this artwork, you notice these massive pillars first. And then when you see this one, what they're sitting on, your eyesight then moves downward. And that then creates the sense of that they're up really high. And then by using the angle of the lines in the background of the buildings, it reinforces this idea that they're really high up. And that's what it's communicating, is that sense of height and grandeur of how big it is and large. Okay, then the last one we're looking at is communicative lines. How lines communicate various things. Then it's a variety of things that way. So, as I mentioned, this goes into directional lines because the direction of lines creates a feeling, that idea of, whoa, that's really large. But lines do a variety of things in communicating. And there's specific types of lines that tend to communicate specific things. At the most basic level, you can look at vertical lines, horizontal lines, and diagonal. And then think about what kind of emotions, ideas can each of these type of lines create. So let's go with vertical first, right? And that's where you have this. So vertical lines, and there's more, it's more than just, these are just some of the basic ones, but they tend to create a sense of stability, authority, and strength, right? Horizontal lines tend to communicate calm, peace, and being passive or passiveness. It also can create movement. And we'll look at that because horizontal lines are often used for movement, but so are vertical. But you tend to think of horizontal movement. If it's behind a person, they're often used to convey movement. And then diagonal lines, right? Those tend to be also, all of these can have movement, but diagonal lines even more than movement. Let's take off movement for a minute because we're going to look at how all three have movement, but diagonal lines even more than horizontal and vertical suggest movement in a way as well. Action and motion. Action and motion and change. Okay, so that you have these basic lines create a sense of communicating different ideas. And these are often used, and you can use them in a couple of different ways. So one is in place of what would be seen as accurate motion or body placement. You tend to see this in cartoons and graphic art, where you're not looking for realism, and instead you use the lines to communicate that. But they also can be the right type of curvature of how someone's moving when you're drawing them is going to either portray correct movement or it's not going to look right. So it isn't going to portray the right thing. So how you're doing these lines is important for portraying that sense of communication. And again, in cartoons and graphic design, you tend to see lines very more clearly because lines can be blended into the overall image, and it conveys a sense of movement. Right, so if I just do a stick figure where they're just standing, that looks like they're not moving, right? Here, we'll make them smiling. But then if I were to put lines like this behind it, most people would know that I'm implying that that stick figure is moving in that direction. Even though by itself, if I didn't put those lines in, it looks like he's just chilling there. Or if I created this diagonal line and then I put a person here, then I put it too close to that. So here we'll go. So it's on some skis here, and they're right. So there's he's got the skis and poles. And this, by having this, the angle of the person plus the diagonal line, right, it looks like that they're moving in a downward motion. You can also create it for a sense of the directional line, where you're drawing your eye to one particular point to emphasize an explosion or something happening really quickly. So let's take a look at those examples. Here you have, right, there's the action lines of the horizontal that implies that they're moving. Now you also have lines in the way that the body is positioned, which is why that'd be important to also emphasize it. But I think that's what's important to show about lines. Even if I draw a stick figure that's just standing straight up and down that by itself looks like there's no movement, the act of putting in those lines creates a communication to the viewer that that person is moving. Here's one with an explosion or being hit. Right, those lines out from a central point that you don't necessarily circle, but by having lines, right, your focus goes right there, and then you move outward, and that implies an explosion or potentially being hit if you have an object in it at first. Here we have implied lines that with the curved component, but also it's important that it's broken up. It implies that the ball is bouncing and that this is the trajectory that the ball went, and that suggests the movement to then where the ball actually is, versus if you just have the ball in the air with none of those lines, you don't get that sense. Or here with water, having the lines that suggest that it looks like the water's moving or falling down, right? This is a good one example of here running the importance of the lines for body positioning, that it makes a difference with my stick figure being in place versus the lines here, and they added some curved lines next to it to create that sense of air movement. But that also, I liked this example here of showing how you use the lines and what creates it a correct communication versus one that can provide an incorrect. So here, the cat's punching the other cat, but that this movement and lines and how the body's laid out doesn't look right, because in real life that's not the movement that would take place if you were punching. Rather, if you have this curved line with a forward movement and then the other curved line going the other way of the person or the cat being hit, it looks correct. Same thing if they're bringing back a bat or whatever, that you have a specific line is going to create the implied movement correctly in our minds versus incorrectly, where then you may not get that same idea unless you did more overt lines in the process. An example of that here, this is from a graphic novel by Clamp, and this here is an explosion, and then you have the lines here coming out, which then directs our eye line to the person being thrown back. And you get that, right? If this person was here all by themselves, you might get a sense of that because of the body positioning, but you get a much clearer concept of what's happening, and it creates this illusion of motion and movement because of the communicative lines taking place here and the directional lines, which is why directional lines and communicative lines go together. Okay, that is where we're stopping with lines. We're going to look at shapes next, and I promise I will try to have a shorter lecture for shapes. It should be. Lines is just so expansive in all the different ways that they do. So we have shapes coming up next, and again, like I said, I will try to not have it be quite as long as lecture. My goal is a shorter lecture for shapes.